Imagine a place where hope fades away and horror takes over everything. A true hell on earth, where thousands of people are condemned to a terrible, agonizing death. This is the tragic story of Nazino, Stalin's island of death, the Cannibal Island. The year is 1933. The Soviet Union under Stalin was a relentless machine. Forced collectivization, political purges, and frenzied industrialization were brutally transforming the largest country on Earth. Just 3 years prior, in 1930, the Gulag was created, an organization in charge of overseeing the forced labor camps. Now, the head of the Gulag itself, Matvey Berman, and the head of the secret police, Genrikh Yagoda, had just proposed to Stalin a so-called grandiose plan to forcibly relocate 2 million people to Siberia and Kazakhstan to turn thousands of square kilometers of virgin land into productive territory. In fact, they found their own idea so good that they decided to implement it without receiving approval from the supreme leader. This grandiose plan intended for the deportees to be peasants, criminals, and above all, kulaks, a term historically reserved for large landowners, but now used by the communist regime to refer derogatorily to any landowner, large or small, who opposed forced collectivization of land. However, interestingly, most of the deportees ended up being city dwellers, especially from Moscow and Leningrad. But how was this possible? It turned out that the plan also included as potential deportees those city dwellers who did not possess an internal passport, a document that aimed, among other things, to cleanse the cities of criminals and other antisocial or socially dangerous elements. These were flexible designations that could include former merchants or anyone who did not fit into the established class structure. Those citizens who were not granted this internal passport were prime targets for arrest and deportation, a process that could take as little as 2 days and was far from being carried out scrupulously. In Moscow alone, between March and July 1933, nearly 86,000 people were arrested and deported for lacking an internal passport. Thus, in late April 1933, convoys departed from Moscow and Leningrad, filled with thousands of these so-called socially dangerous or declassified elements, bound for the massive transit camp in Tomsk, in the vast and frigid Siberia, from where they would later be transferred to the final camps. During the journey to Tomsk, which lasted about 11 days, the authorities provided them with a daily ration of only 300 grams of bread. The criminals among the deportees quickly organized themselves to attack the weakest and forcefully take their food rations and even their clothes. Unfortunately, this was only a small introduction to the savage torment that many of them were about to suffer. Vasily Velichko, the local Communist Party leader in one of the districts with the highest influx of deportees, documented some cases of the people allegedly socially dangerous who were arriving. Even today, reading that report is still chilling. Not even the most loyal communist supporters were safe. Voikin, member of the Communist Party's youth organization since 1929, employed at the Red Textile Worker plant in Serpukhov. Awarded bonuses 3 times. On his weekend, he was heading to a football game. He left his passport at home. Arrested and deported. Guseva, an elderly woman, lives in Murom. Her husband is a longtime communist and head of the Murom train station, where he has worked for 23 years. Her son works there as an apprentice engineer. Guseva went to Moscow to buy a suit for her husband and some white bread. Her documents didn't help her. Arrested and deported. Matveyev, construction worker at Bakery No. 9. Until December 1933, he held a seasonal passport. Arrested with his passport. According to his own words, no one even bothered to check his document. Arrested and deported. Continuing with the story, on May 12th, Barely 2 days after the deportees arrived in Tomsk, a riot broke out because the authorities did not provide them with drinking water. It was brutally suppressed by mounted troops. Then, on May 14th, about 5,000 deportees, of whom it is estimated that a third were criminals, and roughly half were declassified people of all kinds from Moscow and Leningrad, were loaded onto barges and transported in deplorable conditions 800 kilometers north along the Ob River to what would eventually become, at least for many, their grave. During the journey, crammed together, they were only given 200 grams of bread per day. The supervising staff consisted of 2 commanders and 50 guards, all of them newly recruited soldiers who had not been provided with uniforms or even shoes. Finally, on May 18th, the deportees were disembarked on Nazino, a swampy island in the middle of nowhere located between the Ob and Nazino rivers, about 3 kilometers long and 600 meters wide. It should be noted that the images shown are of the current island, which is not the same as in 1933, as it has been modified by movements of the alluvial soil of the Ob River. Upon leaving them on the island, 4,556 men and 322 women were counted, as well as the bodies of 27 unfortunate souls who had not been able to withstand the journey from Tomsk. Additionally, approximately a third of the deportees were in such miserable condition that they were no longer even able to stand. After the disembarkation, the authorities decided to distribute 20 tons of flour, but a massive fight immediately broke out, which the guards resolved with gunfire. The distribution was canceled. On that desolate island, there was no shelter to protect the people from the cold, nor had they been given any tools to build one. Furthermore, since most were city dwellers rather than peasants or kulaks, they did not possess skills that might help them survive in such a wild, hostile environment. That very first day it snowed, so when night fell, they had no choice but to sleep in the open, on the snow. At dawn the next day, 295 new deaths were counted. On that second day, the guards attempted another flour distribution. But once again, a fight broke out. So they decided to distribute it through a kind of brigade leaders, individuals chosen from among the deportees and responsible for groups of 150 people. The problem? Most of these brigade leaders were criminals who abused their position and disposed of the food as they pleased. In any case, although the deportees now had some flour, they did not have any kind of oven or cooking device, so they began eating it mixed with dirty river water, which caused terrible diarrhea to spread among them like wildfire. Soon, the settlers realized that this was a death trap. Panic set in, and many tried to build makeshift rafts to escape. In this desperate attempt, a large number of them drowned. Those who avoided drowning were shot by the guards from the safety of their barges, hunting them down like animals. If a deportee succeeded and managed to escape the guards, they would then face the near-impossible task of surviving in the inhospitable Russian taiga in the middle of nowhere and without food. Panic was soon followed by horror and chaos. Criminal gangs quickly formed and dedicated themselves to terrorizing and extorting the weakest. Murders among the deportees began occurring in fights over food or money. The bodies were looted without remorse. Any valuable item, even gold teeth, was taken without a second thought. To make matters worse, the guards established their own reign of terror, extorting the settlers, trading sex for food, and even executing them for minor offenses, all while generally showing indifference to the criminal gangs. On May 21st, just 3 days after their arrival, health officials counted 70 new corpses. Upon closer examination, they discovered something horrifying. Several of the bodies showed signs of cannibalism. Total dehumanization had come to that island. Apparently, the deportees, desperate at the impossibility of obtaining food or escaping that hellish trap alive, began killing one another just to get a bite of flesh. This cannibalistic practice became widespread. More than 50 deportees were detained for this reason, though being detained was probably the best fate they could have hoped for. On May 27th, another 1,200 deportees were brought to the island, bringing the total to over 6,000. At this point, it's important to note that the area around the island was not completely uninhabited. Although sparsely populated, it was home to the Ostyaks, an indigenous people of the region. Decades later, one of them, a witness to the massacre, would recount the following. The deportees tried to escape. They asked us, "Where is the railway?" We had never seen one. They asked us, "Where is Moscow? Leningrad?" They were asking the wrong people. We had never heard of those places. We are Ostyaks. People fled, starving. The things we saw. People were dying everywhere. They were killing each other. On the island, there was a guard named Kostya Venikov, a young man. He was courting a beautiful girl who had been deported there. He protected her. One day, he had to leave for a while, and he asked one of his comrades, "Take care of her." But with all those people, the comrade could not do much. They seized her, tied her to a poplar tree, cut off her breasts, her muscles, everything they could eat, everything. They were starving. They had to eat. When Kostya, the guard, returned, she was still alive. He tried to save her, but she had lost too much blood. Despite everything, the nightmare of Nazino would soon come to an end. In early June, the authorities decided to keep 157 people on the island due to their extreme weakness, whereas the rest were transferred to other camps. Yet, not as many boats were needed as before. Only 2,856 deportees remained, many of whom died during the new transport or shortly thereafter. Thus, in a count carried out a few months later, it was determined that of the approximately 6,200 deportees sent to Nazino, only about 2,000 remained alive, half of whom were bedridden and gravely ill. Only about 250 were considered physically capable of working. This means that in just a few days, more than 4,000 people had lost their lives. Many bodies had been abandoned where they had fallen. A few others had been buried without identification. While these events were unfolding, a detailed report prepared by Comrade Velichko, mentioned earlier, reached Stalin and the members of the Politburo. An investigative commission was formed and confirmed that the report's findings were accurate. As a result, some of the guards and low-ranking officials involved were sentenced to short prison terms. Others were merely reprimanded. It is said that even Stalin himself was visibly affected upon learning what had happened, which is hard to believe considering we are talking about a man who, when told that his son had been captured in a battle against the Nazis during World War II, grew angry with him for surrendering, even though he had survived, instead of taking his own life. The true culprits of the disaster, Matvei Berman and Genrikh Yagoda, the architects of the grandiose plan, would go unpunished at first. However, ironically, they too would eventually be crushed by the same relentless machinery that was the USSR, a system they had helped to feed. They would end up being accused of treason and sabotage, and were executed just a few years later. What happened at Nazino was not an isolated incident, but rather a logical consequence of the repressive policies implemented by Stalin. Mass deportation, lack of resources, and the brutality of the guards were common practices in the Gulag. The tragedy of Nazino would remain hidden behind the Iron Curtain for a long time, until in 1988, amidst the policy of glasnost, meaning transparency in Russian, it was finally brought to light. More than half a century had passed since the events,